Big up to everybody. Happy Tuesday, and thank you so much to the technical team for their usual support. My name is Michael Jackson, Executive Director of Jamaicans for Justice.
And I'm Jade Williams, the Policy and Advocacy Specialist at Jamaicans for Justice.
So let's start justice. We've been going at this for a while, and I think that the show is building up quite nicely. And I just want to remind those who are listening, of course, that you can call the line at 676-4996, or you can send us a WhatsApp at 239-7583. And of course, the calling in segment is at the second half of the program, about 1:40 thereabout. Some of you have been sending us WhatsApp messages on our social media platforms asking certain questions. Some of them are interesting. There was a video, for example, Jade, of the police apparently pulling over an individual, charging them under the Traffic Act, the new one that we have now that became effective recently, to say that they should have had a carrier license. And when you opened the trunk, you saw some tools, which suggested that this person really had the tools in the car trunk in case the vehicle broke down, or perhaps they were a mechanic. I wasn't sure. But I think it's something I'm going to challenge you as the attorney here, and I'm challenging you publicly. I want the public to be quite aware of what persons are being charged with in terms of tickets perhaps being written, and whether or not this is something on behalf of the Jamaican people that we should actually perhaps first investigate what the law provides for, and then make some inquiries on the public behalf. Several persons have reached out, unfortunately tagging my personal account on Twitter, but
oh wow.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's probably why I wasn't aware. But what I will say just initially is that generally there is an exception to carrying certain instruments, tools that one may use in their profession. Technically, you should be able to explain once you have a reasonable explanation for why you're in possession of this item.
Yeah, and persons reduce it to simply go to court and challenge it. It's such an inconvenience.
It's more than an inconvenience. It can also be an expense, because if you're a person that requires any kind of support, one thing that I always try to bring back to the minds of our listeners is that we do have a low literacy rate in our country, so you going to court to represent yourself might be something that's very difficult for you. If you're to hire somebody, then that is now an additional expense, when possibly you had no reason to be here in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't be subjected. There's nothing in my car trunk except a couple shoes. But, you know, I think it's something I really want us to read the current act versus the last one, and to see whether or not this is something. You know, I think the public ought to be protected. This is not within JFJ's mandate, but definitely we are in the public. Persons see us as that agency that they can make their inquiries to, and I believe that we should respond accordingly.
Okay, right? So I've added an item to my work plan.
It's nothing much, Jay. Let's not overreact here. All right, so in terms of last week, what happened in the news? Last week was budget debate week. We heard from the Minister of Finance before, Dr. Nigel Clark, and we also heard last week from the Leader of Opposition, the Honourable Mark Golding, on Tuesday. And then on Thursday, we heard from our Honourable Prime Minister, Andrew Holness. And there were some interesting things coming out of that budget debate, Jade and listeners. Now, for Mr. Golding, he mentioned quite interestingly, well, you know, that election seems to be drawing near, so JFJ won't be getting into that side of the argument. But Mr. Golding mentioned that a constitutional challenge has been filed to indicate that they want the court to make a declaration on the constitutionality of the state of public emergency. Specifically how it is being utilized.
Absolutely.
Because just to say for the listeners, the SOE is provided for in the Constitution. It's just a matter of whether or not how the Governor General declares an emergency is something that's constitutional within our context, and we don't have a natural disaster. We're not at war with anybody, and none of our institutions have been shut down to the point, for example, where you can't go to the supermarket, right? So that is being challenged by the opposition, the People's National Party. So that was something I believe that.
Yes. And on the note of the SOE, there's one in place now. I think it was called last week.
March 14th.
Yes, we're about 7 days into it now. Have you seen the regulations as yet, Mikkel?
No, but what is interesting for me, and perhaps the government members need to indicate to us if the social media handles that they use, if they selectively respond to persons when they ask them questions. Because JFJ respectfully asked the Prime Minister's page, the Information Minister's page, the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of National Security, and the Minister of Legal and Constitutional Affairs. I looked at the activity of all four. And to be fair to the Legal and Constitutional Affairs Minister and to the National Security Minister, their pages at the time when I looked had no other activity. The other two pages were quite active up to into the night. So my question is, when persons make inquiries, it's a case where perhaps we should have sent an email, or is there a selective response? Because I found it quite disrespectful that Jamaicans for Justice, not only as an organization, but as citizens of this country, asked about the regulations and absolutely no response was provided for.
Yes, absolutely.
But let me go to the Office of the Prime Minister's budget. Again, election seems to be drawing near, but I would focus on that. But within the context of human rights, focusing specifically on things like social and economic justice, the Prime Minister's speech was debatably a good one. There were so many positives coming out of it. You're talking about, and I wrote them down there, the ones that jumped out at me, 74% increase in weekly pension, as well as some increase in NIS benefit, which is important for those who, we still encourage you to go and throw some pension elsewhere, but this is some good benefit. 15% increase in the NHT loan ceiling, so JD can go buy the local house, right? And a couple other areas, the hard trust fees were removed up to level 4. I think that's an associate degree level, especially in a country where you have high crime levels or rate among our younger population. This is certainly welcome news. So kudos to the Prime Minister where that is concerned. 15 areas are to be, well, what's the language? Ecologically sensitive areas will be declared as such.
Okay, well, I look forward to seeing what the regulation of that.
I look forward to the actual legislation governing that. But, yes. And lastly, which I'm sure we're going to be touching on shortly, is that there's a 44% increase in minimum wage. So you're talking about $13,000 weekly, some $50,000 per month. So yes, it was a good Tuesday for those who were listening in. Near 6 hours of speech. The light went at one point. The mic got cut out at one point. PBC went haywire at one point with their responses, but a really, really good speech coming from the Parliament Garden House on that particular day. So we have to big up the Prime Minister. Well, but my big up have a little caveat, because the one, announcements are one thing. We have to ensure that we keep the Prime Minister accountable, his party accountable on implementing these things, because they're far too important on persons' basic rights in terms of social benefits.
Absolutely. And I think we, as you said, it is something that we discussed last week about great things written and not implemented, like our Occupational Safety and Health Act. So yes. I do hope that these welcome social benefits are able to actually reach to the public.
All right, so over to you.
Over to me.
Yes, you don't have your right of the day.
Yes, I do. So yes, I do. Yes, I do. So, or did you know? It's not a right of the day today. It is a did you know today. And it is on our Office of the Services Commission, and it is just letting our listeners know what that office does. Mikkel talks about it quite often, so I feel we should let people know. So it ensures that the appointments, promotions, selections, and training for members of government agencies are done based on merit, and that whatever disciplinary processes or separation processes that are necessary for the maintenance of these departments is managed by the Office of the Services Commission. And I'll go right into our trivia for the week, which states, The question is, what is the proposed minimum wage effective for April 1st, 2023? So what is the proposed increase in the minimum wage that will be effective April 1st, 2023? So there are no options this week. And as you know, if you answer our trivia correctly, then you can receive a phone credit. So you can respond to the trivia via our social media pages at JA for Justice on Instagram or JA for Justice on Twitter. And you can also send a WhatsApp to 239-7583.
All right, so for today's topic, I think it's a timely discussion when we're talking about private sector and the role that they have when it comes to ensuring that employees' rights are respected and the broader context of corporate social responsibility in terms of managing the 3 Ps, as we call it, the planet, the people, and profit. How do you balance all of that? So planet, we're operating in a time now where, for example, we have a constitutional right to a healthy and safe environment. For example, people, those who are in the neighboring communities that you operate, the impact of your business practices on, the external people, if you will, the stakeholders, as well as your employees themselves. How safe is your environment for them? How do you balance all of that and still maintain profit? And there were some interesting things that happened last week when you look at the security guards. For example, you're going to do your work and here come armed gunmen that shoot out at you, put your life at risk. And I remember someone saying on social media that I'm not being paid enough to go through all of that. And the question is, what are some of the reasonable expectations that one can have from the private sector? And how can the private sector ensure their profitability?
Well, just on the point of security, I would want to add that in the Prime Minister's speech in Parliament, he did mention that security guards, their minimum wage would increase from 10,500 to 14,000. So that's the security guards alone. That does not answer your trivia question, listeners.
Okay, nice with the caveat. But Jade, from your perspective, what are some of the things that we should be looking out for in terms of legislation and policy that perhaps private sector should really be ensuring?
Well, a couple of things. Firstly, we spoke about it last week, but our Occupational Safety and Health Act, I think, is something that our private sector should be taking into consideration. It's back on the legislative agenda.
So the law no pass, but private sector must ensure it's there.
I think as private sector continues to operate, it is important to ensure the safety and health of your workers. Yes, I do think that we also need to talk a bit about the Sexual Harassment Act, which is in place and would be expected to be implemented I believe soon, actually. And we would also pay attention to, for example, how persons are compensated, whether or not persons receive paternity leave. It is not something that is currently legislated as yet. Some corporations have pledged to engage it or have engaged it, but it is not something that is on our books legislatively. And there have been other discussions throughout, for example, the pandemic period, where we spoke to flexi work hours, we spoke to remote working conditions, and what that may look like, restructuring the work week to ensure the productivity of employees
is
for
maintained.
example. Yes.
All right, perfect. So joining us to discuss the topic right after the break is John Mahfood, president of the Jamaica Manufacturing Exporters Association. Hi, welcome back to Let's Talk Justice. We're discussing the matter of employee rights and broader issues of corporate social responsibility within the workplace, private sector. And we're joined by Mr. John Mahfood. Good afternoon, Mr. Mahfood.
Good afternoon.
Thank you so much for joining. This is Michael Jackson and Jade Williams from JFJ. So if we can just start from, let me just start with your immediate reaction to the minimum wage issue.
Yeah, you know, it's first of all, the minimum wage was too low before, and you know, to be fair, even though I'm going to criticize the way the amount of the increase, I also have to recognize that 13,000 is really not a livable wage. But the problem is, and the positive of increasing the minimum wage is that hopefully it will bring more people into the employment, the formal employment sector. We have almost 800,000 people that are not looking for jobs, are not considered in terms of our unemployment rate. Our unemployment rate is very low, 3.5%, but it excludes about 800,000 people that are not considered looking for work. So an increase like this is going to help to encourage young people to come into the workforce. And of course, the other issue of the waiver of the hard fees will also be a good thing, and hopefully will bring more people into the labor force. The problem was the extent of the increase. Last year, April, it was increased from 7,000 to 9,000. Then I think most people thought that increase was too low. Then they moved just over a year later, from 9,000 to 13,000. So in about a year, they increased the minimum wage by 86%. I am concerned that there are many small employers and individuals who are going to find that a bit of a shock. They might not be in the best place possible to absorb such an increase all at once and so suddenly. And of course, it will impact on the rate of inflation, because as you move your minimum wage up significantly, it also has an impact on the buying power of people.
Yeah.
So just to summarize, I think it's a good thing, but I would have preferred more regular and smaller increases in the minimum wage. So going forward, one hopes that it is not going to be a long time before it's reviewed again in another year and it's topped up.
Thanks, Mr. Mahfood. As you can imagine, those of us at JFJ, we're strong, ardent human rights defenders, and some of our listeners and those on social media would have been perhaps chastising private sector a little bit with saying that why the complaint about the sudden increase. As you rightly outlined, $13,000 is still not a livable wage. And you said something, and perhaps it fits within the broader context of the discussion. How do we ask private sector to balance some of these things of employee rights, providing, appropriate gears, outfitting offices? Disabilities Act was passed recently. How do you balance those expenses based on your size and all of these things while making profit? What would be your immediate response to some of those criticisms?
Well, in the case, to me, if you employ people, you should ensure that you give people the requisite benefits that you can afford. And although I know that it's something you're going to talk about a little later, in terms of CSR, there are certain things in Jamaica, because we are a small, poor country. We are not able to provide the type of salary that is really livable. Our per capita income is only 5,000 US a year. That's the lowest beside Haiti in the Caribbean. And so we need to find ways of increasing that through economic development. But in the meantime, if people can only survive on a salary, you have to look about other things. You have to look about their medical, and more importantly than anything else, you have to look at their ability to retire. And so you have to provide the facility for employees to have a pension fund, so that when they reach 65 or 70, they don't have to continue working, and they don't have to rely on relatives. And that's one thing is very, very lacking in Jamaica, is a lack of private pension funds and people who are unpensioned. And that's something I would love to see change.
Before Jade has her question, but there was an interesting tidbit I wanted to share. Dr. Peter and Baker shared a tweet to say that elders in France they were protesting
Yes.
the age of retirement moving from 60 to 64.
And it can go up to 67.
And it's interesting, in Jamaica, we would want it push up to 70 because we're so in desperate need of the funds. Yeah, it's just an interesting comparison. But go ahead, Jade.
Oh, yes. Well, I was going to take it from the CSR perspective and ask, from where you sit as president of JMEA, do you see where our manufacturers and our manufacturing companies have adopted CSR policies? Is that a widely adopted thing here?
I don't think that it is widely adopted in a formal sense. Obviously, companies that go on the Jamaica Stock Exchange, whether it's the junior stock exchange or the main exchange, are exposed to these types of things, including corporate governance and social responsibility, and of course their ability to pay is also enhanced. But remember, the bulk of our employees in Jamaica, other than the public sector, are employed by very small companies. And these companies, to a large extent, are trying to find their way. They're struggling. And so they're under a lot of pressure. And I don't think they are able or consider this as one of their primary responsibilities. I think their belief is to employ people, but probably they are very careful about how much they pay. But I think that companies in the middle income and large companies have a serious responsibility to not only their employees, but to the environment in which they're in, because in Jamaica, your most companies are somewhere near a ghetto area. They're somewhere near areas where people are barely surviving, where the education system is under stress. And I think we have to look at how companies in these environments can reach out and help the community around them and build that bond between the company and the community. And in my feeling is one important way is through the education, through the basic schools, through the primary schools, and if possible, help those students in terms of clothing, in terms of books, in terms of making sure that they have food to eat and so on. That's an important thing. In terms of our employees, the issue recently has come to light about the guards in Jamaica, the 26,000 guards that secure us and protect us. Those guards in general had no benefits whatsoever and still don't. They get a salary. They have to work 60 hours a week in order to get $16,000. No sick leave, no vacation leave, no maternity leave. And these are people that are there protecting us. And it's just come to light. I think that is the kind of thing that if we all need to be aware of and say that's not acceptable in a Jamaican situation.
As you said that, I remember following the NHT ruling, which triggered a lot of the conversation around compensation and benefits for a security guard. And there is no, a compensation review being done by security firms. And I remember Mr. George Overton, who is the director of operations, so Guardsman Group, I believe, saying that, yes, from his perspective, he would love to pay more, even without that ruling. But are people, the customers, willing to pay? Or are we willing participants and advocates of race to the bottom, wherein we want the cheapest price by any means necessary? So do you think that is something, Mr. Mahfood, that customers or companies rather will be contending with? are my customers willing to pay more than what I'm currently providing? How do they balance that?
Your customers are going to have to pay more. The question is going to be how much more, and so it's a real big issue when you think about 26,000 security guards and the companies they protect, and in fact half of the security, the government actually employs half the security guards in Jamaica through the private firms. So it's now just a matter of time and negotiations to determine the extent of that increase. But it will be significant. It will be in the 30 to 35% range, and some companies may not be able to afford that. But I feel that in general, if they keep the increase within that range, there will not be a large fallout in the security system. What it may also do is encourage companies that have 2 or 3 or more guards to look at electronic security in addition to live security, humans. Yeah. So we may have that happen, but at least the situation is there now, and we're going to at least be able to fix the payment and the other benefits that security guards get. But it just showed you that we are not. I don't think most of us even, and I employed security guards. It never struck me that this was the situation. So we need to be aware of what.
For me, Mr. Mahfood, because I want to pick up on that point that you mentioned, not being so aware of some of the issues facing like the security guards. And I want to pick up in terms of the role that private sector companies play in advancing employee rights, making their own proposals to the legislator and so on. So we will pick up with the conversation. Please stay with us.
Welcome back to Let's Talk Justice. We are discussing today private sector and social responsibility, and we are joined by Mr. John Mahfood. I just want to remind our listeners that you can call in at 1:45 at the studio line 876-676-4996, or you can send your messages to 239-7583 via WhatsApp. So, Mr. Mahfood, before we left, you were talking a bit about some of the issues that employers may not be aware of that are affecting their employees. And we considered what role can employers play in advancing the rights of their employees. Is this something that they should proactively be considering? Is this something that they should be making submissions in Parliament in relation to, for example, like we recently passed our Disabilities Act, Sexual Harassment Act? So what role does the manufacturing industry, the employer industry have in advancing those rights for workers?
Well, I would say to you that the employer and the employer groups like our JMEA and so on are not the ideal body to advocate for employees. That's my personal feeling. However, as employers looking for the best employees and looking for employees, you have to be very competitive, and this came home to me and to others in our group last year as we came off COVID and the economy opened up. And like the tourism sector opened up fast and had to recruit, 100,000 employees back into their system. There was a serious shortage of employees. And this is at a time, too, when the hotel sector is not only opening up, but they're growing. The BPO sector is growing. And the BPO sector is paying they're paying better salaries than, say, a small manufacturing company or a retailer. And so what we saw happening last year is difficulty finding staff and staff moving from companies that weren't paying very well to companies that were paying better salaries. So the natural the natural situation is that as the economy grows, and it is growing now post-COVID, and I think 2023 is going to be a good year. We're going to see a lot of competition for employees. So the hotel sector is expected to add 8,000 rooms. They're going to need about 25,000 employees. The BPO sector is continuing to grow. The manufacturing sector is growing. So in 2023, going into 24, you're looking at trying to attract, upwards of 35,000 people into the workforce. And you won't be successful if you're not competitive in your salary and offering, benefits that somebody else is not offering. I would say to you, for instance, one of the kind of disappointments I have is that while the tourism sector is one of the most important sectors in our society, and it's growing, and employing upwards of 150,000 people and going to be growing more, they're not providing houses for their employees.
And sometimes not even transportation, Mr. Mahfood, from employees leaving the hotels late at night and putting themselves at risk.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and we also have to reflect on the fact that a hotel worker may not be a full-time 52-week or a year worker. He's going to be laid off sometimes and so on. So it's a difficult job. It's a demanding job, and one that requires him to put out a huge amount of customer service and smiles and so on.
Yeah.
And I think that, to expect them to travel 40 miles from an unsatisfactory environment is not good for our tourism industry. That's one thing. The other area where companies, I think, are more and more advocating is for a change in the laws for pensions.
Yes.
So there is going around now is a system called opt-out, which is that all companies will be required to provide private pension availability to employees, where the employees have to contribute 3%. The company does not have to contribute if it doesn't want to, but at least it provides that opportunity for the employee to contribute towards his retirement. Although it won't be mandatory, the employee can say, no, I don't want it. It will be automatic unless he says no. So those are some of the things that I think are very, very important, and that and companies can make a difference.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Mr. Mahfood. We certainly appreciate your time with us, and I hope we can speak as soon as possible, to see what partnership can come about between JFJ and, of course, the JMEA and other private sector groups, because I think it's a conversation worth having. Because one of the things is, though we talk about the minimum requirements, for vacation leave and so on, you do have some private sector who can afford to, who have risen above and done much more. So it's a conversation that we would certainly want to continue.
Sure, thank you.
Thanks again, and have a good day.
Thank you.
So Jade, that was a good conversation. I think there was something else that the leader of opposition said in his budget debate. I don't remember the terminology, but basically that employees can almost buy a share, I believe, in the companies. Not sure if you heard it.
Yeah, I heard it. It is almost like you are gaining capital in the company that you work, which is not.
It's not like the stock exchange, the stock market concept. No.
It is something that I think is practiced more widely in the first world. But I have heard where, as a part of your incentive to join this company, especially in certain professions that require so much investment of your personal time, they offer you what would be a stake in the company, so a small portion of ownership that would allow for you to gain from the profit that you are producing from this company, for this company as well.
I mean, and there are so many other things, but I'm very cautious. I really do believe private sector can and should do more. And you have seen some companies, Grace Kennedy, for example, downtown, they do excellent work with the neighboring communities. Sandals Foundation, done by Westmoreland, building basic schools and so on. You think about JMEA, who I do believe already have paternity leave. My colleagues in the banks, they show off on me that their vacation leave is twice my amount. I need to speak to my board of directors that I need double up.
Yes, I've heard of some people.
I don't bother advocate beside me. You're not getting
I've just heard of some people that can that they can roll over their vacation leave outside in private sector as well.
For how long? Not like the public sector. You roll over, you take all 2 years leave one time.
Well, I don't know about the limits in their particular company, but I did speak to someone recently who was working at a banking company as well. That was able to add up about 3 years worth of vacation leave and be able to take a 2-month vacation. So I think it's
these are important things to really discuss. You look at the hotel industry, and Mr. Mahfood mentioned it. They started a pension initiative within the industry. How do we say to people that I really would have preferred, for example, to retire at 50, can't afford to?
Yes.
But how do you say to people you should be focusing on pension planning, and what mechanisms can the company, the employer, put in place to support you? I think these things, it needs ventilation. And I do have a pet peeve, and I think I tweeted it. On certain international days, World Disabilities Awareness Week, for example, recently we had International Women's Day, and you have all the private sector companies on social media painting their pages purple. Nice PR going on. And then I started asking myself, the Sexual Harassment Act has not yet commenced. However, what policies do you have? Do you have the bare minimum for maternity leave? What is the ratio when it comes to your senior management? What is the ratio when it comes to your board? And if you can't answer those questions favorably, I think you should take down those advertisements on social media with the greatest of respect.
Yes, I do think there's a certain, they talk about it in particular with environmental issues where they call it greenwashing. I don't know what you would call it here, pinkwashing maybe. But it is where, as a part of trying to present as a corporate, like a responsible corporate entity, a company would advertise their investment in some social issue, but only on the day when it's relevant to do so, as you would have mentioned with international.
You're just milking a particular situation. We're going to take the break, and then when we return, we take your calls and we have some discussions on some disturbing things we saw in the news last week.
Yes.
Welcome back to Let's Start Justice. We were having some discussions earlier, very good conversation with John Mahfood around, private sector and advocating and advancing employee rights and corporate social responsibility. But we want to shift focus a little bit. 2 things jumped out at me, Jade, last week. Radam. You know what that terminology means?
I'm not one of the hip young people, so tell me.
I don't know how to explain it, but I saw it one day on either the Office of the Prime Minister page or the Honorable Prime Minister Andrew Holness's Twitter account, and I asked somebody what it meant. They made an attempt to explain it to me. I'm worse, not a millennial that keeps up with these things. But following the Prime Minister's budget debate, which I did say was debatably a good one, there was a member in the gallery, Apparently they call him what, the peanut dread.
Okay.
That's the term.
Mm-hmm.
And some persons who are quite political motivated, I'm aware, so I didn't necessarily respond. Well, I didn't respond to any of those tweets, but some persons on Twitter reached out to me and they showed me a couple of videos with this gentleman who apparently is the genesis, for lack of a better word, of the term radam.
Oh, okay, so this is the inventor of the term.
Yes. So, out of curiosity, I watched some of those videos. I put down my phone because it was upsetting to watch. When you talk about the level of misogynistic views, disparaging comments about women, about what he may or may not own on the female body or anatomy, if you're with him, arguably promoting sexual and domestic violence, and this is the person that the government of the day decided to put in the House of Parliament. And I was most offended. And I think as much as how the government wants to connect with young people, Mr. Prime Minister, this was not it. There is a time when one must be circumspect in what they want to associate themselves with. So you can't radam with someone who promotes violence against women, not when 1 in 4 women experience sexual and domestic violence in this country, not when there is complete ineptitude in passing domestic violence laws, not when there is an unwillingness to advance the Sexual Offences Act. And you have this man in Parliament, in that house that we treasure, that ought to be passing laws, and you thought that was something that was what? Cool?
You know, I understand your outrage. I understand your outrage, and I have to even think of it in the context of what we were going to talk about next, our most recent story of minors 17 and 16.
A 15-year-old, 14-year-old. My mother is a teacher. So to segue into the issue, you see 12 and 13-year-old grabbing their little girlfriends in high school.
Yes.
With such physical violence there.
Yes.
Because woman must be owned. Yeah?
Yes.
And in last week, it came to light because I was seeing some headlines from several media reports. 13-year-old boy charged with rape.
Yes.
There was one down by Hanover, Westmoreland, down that side. A 15-year-old boy.
Yes.
Was charged with 7 counts of rape.
Absolutely.
But what made the case interesting, Jade and listeners, he gave the police wrong name. You know why? He was apprehended before and out on bail for a similar offense. So when our youngsters are not getting the type of comprehensive sex education, and you see somebody like Mr. Radam in Parliament, what signal are you sending? And I'm not saying, don't get me wrong, that one appearance would have led to these situations. I'm not making any false correlation here. But I'm saying that again, our leaders must lead by example and be careful what you're endorsing.
Absolutely.
And I think from a place of, as I said, there are about 3 or 4 reports.
Yes, because even the one I
incident.
referenced, you didn't reference, which was the one in St. Elizabeth with a 12-year-old victim who went to visit this house to use the internet for school. And the incident took place in January 2021. Whilst there, 2 teenage boys who would have been in the residence at the time held down the girl to sexually assault her 16 and 17-year-old offenders who are now being charged with rape. So when I think about just the prolificness of these incidents, as you said, we just have to be more mindful about how we associate what could be taken as an acceptance of certain views, how we associate ourselves with those things.
Yeah, and you know, I think there needs to be a broader discussion, Jade, because the levels of violence against women our girls, it's very high.
Yes.
But I thought it was shocking that the perpetrators are minors, of minors themselves. And we know of these things. You live, for example, in what we call a big yard. I grew up in a big yard in St. Anne. 6 of us were sleeping on a bed. Were sleeping on a bed at 1.6. And you heard about situations in other households, for example, wherein the very nature of the setup of the house, so many people living together, that abuse through incest occurs. And when you look at the rape statistics, majority of the perpetrators tend to be close family members or close neighbors. So when you look at it, what can be done to change the mindset of our youngsters? Because the frequency is jarring and alarming, I think.
You know, I think it's a general need to address what I perceive to be just a rising level of criminality in general amongst minors, even outside of sexual violence. As at February 2022, we had 16 minors charged under the Firearms Act. Majority of those being for illegal possession of an offensive weapon. So at this point, what is the child diversion effort looking like? What is our social investment effort looking like? What is our public education in terms of sexual and reproductive health looking like?
And the conversations that we're having, I think it's important. As a parent myself, you know how I interact with my youngster.
Absolutely.
He's a brilliant young man, and I think he can handle the conversation. But age appropriateness and development appropriateness is have to be considered. But I teach my child healthy dating relationship. I went on a movie date with him. Of course, I had to drop him off and hide out in the car and so on. My son actually stalked me more than I stalked him. I told him that he tracked the iPhone and could tell me exactly where I was.
Yes.
But we have this conversation, and I said to him, this is what is appropriate at age 14. I speak to the parent of the girl child that he was going on his date with. And I teach him about consent. And I teach him about when you have a little urging to keep them to yourself and the people, them girl child, We have these conversations. I remember when I was younger and I used the word abortion to my grandaunt. One slap crossed my face. Because how dare you use that language in front of me, little pitney? It goes against everything in my Bible. My son and I, we can have this conversation about age of consent. You know what he said to me, Jade? I was listening to an interview that Damien Crawford was doing, and he heard, let's change the age of consent to 18. And he said to me, oh, the law is going to keep my urgings down. That's what he said. And he said, Mommy, had it not been for some of these conversations that we have had, perhaps I would have made a different choice.
Yes.
Because he said, the opportunity has come to him before. I make light of it. But when you look at it, how are we informing our children? What is the National Parenting Commission doing? I would hope one day we can have them on the call.
No, for sure. And, just anecdotally, I can say it on the show, JFJ is currently running a survey on the perceptions of rape. If you want to participate, there's a link on our social media pages. But as part of that survey, when we went out into the communities, anecdotally, people want students, children, to know these things. That I don't know if it's a societal shift. I don't know
because they challenged it in 2013.
Yes, but I think that people are recognizing in our current landscape that the place of ignorance is no longer where we can sit with our minors.
Yeah.
And they want to see some comprehensive
bury
sexuality
our heads
education.
in the sand and not speaking to them and still use language like what? Teely?
Exactly, because how do you expect them to make responsible choices about something that they have no real knowledge about?
Yeah. Right. So that was our little ranting for the day, but it was upsetting, as you can imagine.
Yes.
Right, so over to you with your trivia.
Yes, so I'll look into the producer's box. Do we have a winner for our trivia this week? Yes, we do.
I think we gave away the answers from the start of the program, go right up to when we're doing the interview.
Well, one thing I will say, you did mention it when you mentioned the Prime Minister's speech. If anybody could do their percentages, they would have gotten it.
Actually, it was said. Yeah.
Okay. Our producer is calling her out loud and clear. She said it twice. Okay. So who was our attentive listener who got the answer correct? Okay, so we have 2 winners. So that means it's not a lot of credit this week, guys.
We're splitting it, okay.
Okay, so we have Azasaji back again. I think this is your second win. And we have It's Petrina. Okay, so
But I want to say to both, they come and they answer the question every week and get the local credit and they're not calling the radio program with it. Listen, no need to do better.
Yes, absolutely. So Azasaji, I hope to hear from you next week on the phone. We'll be looking out for your call in the studio. Thank you very much for joining us.
Yes, thanks again for Let's Start Justice. I'm Michael Jackson.
And I'm Jane Williams.